The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption, Wyoming. As Faith Vance gripped the telegram that had shattered her world, tears blurring her vision as she stared at the abandoned homestead she'd inherited. The year was 1875, and at 22, she now stood alone in a town that had nearly dried up after the mine closed, leaving nothing but weathered buildings and broken dreams. Faith had arrived on the afternoon stage with high hopes, only to find her uncle's funeral had been attended by no one. His debts had driven away his friends, and the promised thriving cattle ranch was nothing but a dilapidated shack with a few acres of parched land. Her life savings had purchased the stage-coach ticket from Boston, and now there was no money to return east. "Everyone left," she whispered, her voice catching as she stood on the creaking porch, her traveling trunk beside her, the wind tugging at her dark hair that had come loose from its pins. "Everyone but me," came a deep voice from behind, Faith startled, turning to see a tall man leaning against the porch post. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out strong features weathered by sun and wind. He wasn't young, perhaps in his early 30s, and his eyes held a quiet intensity as they met hers. "Samuel Hayes," he said, straightening up and removing his hat. "I was your uncle's neighbor to the west, promised him I'd look in on you when you arrived." Faith brushed the tears from her cheeks, attempting to regain her composure. "It seems my uncle misled me about many things in his letters. This isn't exactly the thriving ranch he described," Samuel nodded, a hint of sadness crossing his tanned face. Frank was always more hopeful than practical. "But he meant well." "Well, his well-meaning has left me stranded in the middle of nowhere with nothing," Faith said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Not nothing," Samuel corrected gently. "You've got 40 acres, a roof that only leaks in 3 places, and a neighbor willing to help." Despite her distress, Faith found herself studying the cowboy more closely. His clothes were worn but clean, his manner direct but not unkind. There was something reassuring about his presence that made the vast emptiness around her seem less threatening. "I appreciate the sentiment, Mr. Hayes, but I don't see how anyone can help this situation. I have no funds to return east, and I know nothing about ranching or surviving out here." Samuel looked out at the land, which was bathed in the fading light. "Your uncle's land has good water better than most. That's worth something out here." He turned back to her. "I can help you get settled tonight, and tomorrow we can figure out your next steps." Faith hesitated. She'd been raised to be wary of strangers, especially men, but in this wilderness she had little choice. "That would be appreciated," Samuel nodded, picking up her trunk effortlessly. "Let's get you inside before dark. Coyotes get to singing their night song soon." The inside of the cabin was surprisingly clean, if sparse. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a narrow bed stood in the corner, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs occupied the center of the room. "I tidied up when I heard you were coming," Samuel explained, setting down her trunk. "Wasn't sure when you'd arrive." "You did this?" Faith asked, surprised that this rugged cowboy would concern himself with housekeeping. Seemed the proper thing to do. He moved to the fireplace, stacking kindling. Nights get cold, even in late spring. As he worked, Faith noticed his hands strong and capable but gentle in their movements. She'd never seen someone start a fire with such efficiency, and within minutes, warmth began to fill the small space. "I'll bring over some provisions from my place," Samuel said, standing. "Nothing fancy, but it'll keep you fed." "Mr. Hayes," Faith called as he reached the door. "Why are you helping me? You don't know me." Samuel paused, his expression thoughtful. "Out here we look after our own. Your uncle wasn't perfect, but he was a good neighbor. Besides," he added with the hint of a smile, "someone has to stay when everyone else leaves." True to his word, Samuel returned with enough food for several days: beans, coffee, jerky, and to Faith's surprise, fresh eggs and bread. They shared a simple meal, during which he explained the basics of the property: where to find the well, which fences needed mending, and which of the few remaining chickens still laid eggs. As Samuel prepared to leave for the night, Faith felt a wave of panic at the thought of being alone in this strange place. Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, hating how vulnerable she sounded. He nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "First light." "There's a lot to show you if you're planning to stay." "I don't know if I'm staying," Faith admitted, "but I need to understand what I've inherited before I can decide what to do next." Fair enough, Samuel said. Get some rest, Miss Vance. Wyoming looks different in the morning light. That night, lying in her uncle's bed, Faith listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the prairie, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the cracks in the walls, the occasional creaking of the house settling. She thought about Samuel Hayes, this unexpected ally in a place where she felt utterly lost. There was something in his eyes that spoke of his own hardships, yet he had shown her nothing but kindness. Morning came with golden light streaming through the single window. Faith had just finished dressing when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Looking outside, she saw Samuel approaching, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with a chestnut coat. "Hope you know how to ride," he called as she stepped onto the porch. "Got a lot of ground to cover today." Faith hesitated. "I've ridden in Boston parks, but never like this. Daisy here is steady as they come. She was your uncle's, been keeping her fed at my place." Over the next several days, Samuel showed Faith every corner of her property. He pointed out the small creek that ran year-round, the best grazing areas, and the places where the fence line needed repair. He taught her how to check the chicken coop for eggs without getting pecked, how to work the temperamental pump at the well, and how to spot the signs of approaching weather. Each evening, exhausted but somehow invigorated, Faith would invite him to stay for supper, which they prepared together from her dwindling supplies. Samuel was not a talkative man, but as they worked side by side, he began to share pieces of his story, how he'd come west after the war, seeking a fresh start, how he'd built his small ranch acre by acre, and how he'd learned to appreciate the harsh beauty of Wyoming. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" Faith asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast sky. Samuel considered her question before answering. "There's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I've been both. These days, I'm mostly just alone." "And which am I?" Faith asked softly. His eyes met hers in the fading light. "That depends on what you decide to do with your inheritance." A week after her arrival, Faith rode into town with Samuel to purchase supplies. Redemption was indeed a shadow of what it once had been. Half the storefronts boarded up, the saloon quiet even at midday, and the few people on the street regarding her with curious stares. At the general store, the proprietor, a gruff man named Jenkins, looked surprised to see her. "So you're Frank's niece," he said, sizing her up. "Folks were betting you'd be on the next stage out after seeing that worthless piece of land he left you." Faith felt her cheeks flush with indignation. "It's not worthless to me." Samuel, standing quietly behind her, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Miss Vance is learning fast, Jenkins. Might surprise everyone," the storekeeper snorted. "No offense, madam, but this country eats city folk alive, especially women on their own." "I'm not entirely on my own," Faith replied, suddenly conscious of Samuel's hand still resting on her shoulder. As they loaded supplies into Samuel's wagon, Faith noticed a group of men watching them from the saloon porch. "Who are they?" she asked quietly. Samuel glanced over, his expression hardening. "Cattle barons from the big spread north of here, the Blackstone outfit. They've been buying up all the small ranches since the mine closed. Did they approach my uncle? Every month like clockwork. Frank wouldn't sell no matter how much they offered." Samuel helped her onto the wagon seat. "They won't be happy to see you settling in." On the ride back to the homestead, Faith was quieter than usual, processing this new information. "Samuel," she said finally, using his first name for the first time, "do you think I'm foolish for considering staying?" He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "I think it takes courage to face the unknown, and I think Wyoming could use more courage these days." That night, a spring storm rolled across the prairie, fierce and sudden. Faith awoke to the sound of rain hammering on the roof and wind howling around the cabin. Then came an alarming crack. One of the shutters had torn loose and was banging violently against the side of the house. Wrapping herself in a shawl, Faith lit a lamp and ventured to the window, trying to secure the shutter, but the wind was too strong, nearly tearing it from her grasp. Suddenly, through the sheets of rain, she saw a figure on horseback approaching. Fear gripped her until she recognized Samuel's familiar silhouette. He was drenched by the time he reached the porch, water streaming from his hat and coat. "Thought you might need some help," he shouted over the storm as she opened the door. Together, they managed to secure the broken shutter. The rain had found its way through the leaky roof, and Samuel helped Faith place buckets to catch the worst of it. As the storm raged outside, they sat by the fire, drinking coffee to ward off the chill. "You didn't have to ride out in this," Faith said, watching him as the firelight cast shadows across his face. "I know how frightening these storms can be when you're not used to them," he replied simply. It was in that moment, with rain drumming on the roof and the wind howling like a living thing, that Faith realized she was developing feelings for this quiet, steadfast man. It wasn't just gratitude for his help or appreciation for his knowledge, it was something deeper. A connection that had formed through shared work and quiet conversations. As the weeks passed, Faith threw herself into learning everything she could about ranching. She discovered she had a knack for working with the chickens, expanding the coop and increasing egg production. Samuel helped her mend fences and repair the worst of the roof leaks, and together they planted a small vegetable garden. She began selling eggs and vegetables in town, earning enough to slowly make improvements to the property. Word spread about the Boston lady who stayed, and gradually, some of the townspeople began to treat her with a grudging respect. But not everyone welcomed her determination to make a life in redemption. One afternoon, as Faith was returning from town, she found 2 riders from the Blackstone Ranch waiting by her gate. They were polite but firm. The company wanted her land and was prepared to pay a generous sum. "This land isn't for sale," Faith told them, straightening her spine despite her racing heart. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." The men exchanged glances. "Madam, you might want to reconsider. Small ranchers are having all sorts of bad luck lately, mysterious cattle deaths, wells running dry, fires starting out of nowhere." Faith understood the threat clearly but refused to show fear. "Good day, gentlemen." That evening when Samuel came by, as had become his daily custom, she told him about the visitors. "I was afraid of this," he said, his expression grave. "The Blackstone outfit doesn't take rejection well." "What should I do?" Samuel sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "I won't tell you to sell, that's your decision, but you should know what you're up against." Over supper, he explained that the Blackstone Ranch was owned by Everett Blackstone, a wealthy Easterner who rarely visited his holdings, leaving operations to his ruthless foreman, Victor Marsh. For years, they had been systematically acquiring land to create a cattle empire, using methods that ranged from financial pressure to outright intimidation. "Your uncle was one of the few who held out," Samuel explained. "His water rights are valuable. Your creek is one of the few that doesn't dry up in summer." "Is that why you've stayed too, because of the water on your land?" Samuel looked at her thoughtfully. "Partly, but mostly because this is home now. I fought too hard for it to give up." That night, Faith lay awake thinking about Samuel's words. When had this harsh, beautiful place started to feel like home to her as well? And when had Samuel Hayes become such an essential part of that feeling? The next morning, Faith woke to the smell of smoke. Running outside in her nightdress, she saw flames licking at her chicken coop. Samuel, who had apparently been approaching for his daily visit, was already there, throwing buckets of water on the fire. Together, they managed to extinguish the flames before they could spread, but half the coop was destroyed and several chickens had perished. As they surveyed the damage, Samuel knelt to examine the ground. "This was deliberate," he said grimly, pointing to a broken lantern hidden in the brush nearby. "Blackstone's warning." Faith felt her hands trembling, equal parts fear and fury. "They think this will make me leave. It's how they operate. Small damages at first, then escalating if you don't take the hint." Samuel stood, his eyes meeting hers. "Faith, no one would blame you if you decided to sell." "Would you sell, Samuel?" she challenged. "No," he admitted, "but I've been fighting this battle longer than you have." "Then teach me to fight it too." Over the next few days, they rebuilt the chicken coop stronger than before. Samuel began teaching Faith how to use a rifle not just for hunting, but for protection. They established a routine of checking the property boundaries each morning and evening, looking for signs of trespassers. Word of the fire spread through town, and to Faith's surprise, several of the remaining small ranchers came to visit, offering help and sharing their own stories of Blackstone's intimidation tactics. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Faith felt part of a community beleaguered and dwindling but resilient. As summer advanced, Faith's garden flourished, and she began to sell more produce in town. The extra income allowed her to purchase 2 milk cows, which Samuel helped her select at a livestock auction in the next county. Her days fell into a pattern hard work from dawn until dusk, but satisfying in a way her privileged Boston upbringing had never prepared her for. And through it all, there was Samuel. He never failed to ride over at least once a day, often staying to help with chores or share a meal. Their easy companionship deepened, conversations growing more personal, silences more comfortable. Sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite define, something beyond friendship, but carefully restrained. One evening in late July, as they sat on her porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Faith found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Samuel, why didn't you ever marry?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft. "I was engaged before the war. When I came back, I wasn't the same man who left. Neither was she. We both knew it wouldn't work. And since then..." "Out here, there aren't many opportunities to court a lady," he said with a small smile, "and I suppose I got used to my own company. Until I arrived and disrupted your peaceful existence," Faith said lightly. Samuel turned to her, his expression serious. "You didn't disrupt anything, Faith. You improved it." The air between them seemed to change, charged with unspoken feelings. For a moment, Faith thought he might reach for her hand or say something more, but instead he stood, placing his hat back on his head. "It's getting late. I should head back." As August brought scorching heat, a new threat emerged: drought. The creek on Faith's property, while still flowing, had diminished to a trickle. The grass was turning brown, and dust devils swirled across the parched earth. Then came the day Faith discovered her water was being diverted. Following the creek upstream, she found a recently constructed dam on Blackstone land, deliberately rerouting the water away from her property. Furious, she rode into town to speak with Sheriff Miller, only to be told there was nothing he could do. The dam was on Blackstone property and water rights were complicated. "This is theft," Faith insisted, but the sheriff merely shrugged, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "Miss Vance, my advice is to consider Mr. Blackstone's offer. Things will only get harder from here." Faith left the sheriff's office seething. She was tying her horse to the hitching post outside the general store when a well-dressed man approached her. "Miss Vance." "Victor Marsh, foreman of Blackstone Ranch." He tipped his hat politely, but his eyes were cold. "I understand you're having water troubles." "Troubles that your dam created," Faith replied tartly. Marsh smiled thinly. "These things happen in drought years. Of course, as part of the Blackstone operation, your land would have access to our reservoir system." "My land is not for sale, Mr. Marsh." His smile disappeared. "Don't be foolish, Miss Vance. You're out of your depth here. Ask Hayes what happens to people who don't cooperate with progress." "What does that mean?" Faith demanded, but Marsh was already walking away. That evening, Faith rode to Samuel's ranch, needing to understand Marsh's cryptic warning. Samuel's place was similar to hers, but better established: a solid cabin with a covered porch, a sturdy barn, and corrals containing several horses and a small herd of cattle. She found him mending tack outside the barn. When she told him about her encounter with Marsh, Samuel's face darkened. "Come inside," he said, leading her to his cabin. Inside, Samuel poured them both coffee before sitting across from her at his kitchen table. 5 years ago, there were a dozen small ranches around here. Now there's just yours, mine, and old Johnson's place up north. The others all sold to Blackstone, one by one. But why the reference to you specifically?" Samuel's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "Because I organized resistance. Several of us filed complaints about Blackstone's tactics with the territorial governor. We were gathering evidence of their illegal activities. What happened? A fire. My barn burned to the ground with all my winter hay inside. The same night, my partner Tom Weber's house caught fire while he was sleeping." Samuel's voice grew rough with emotion. "He didn't make it out." Faith covered her mouth in horror. "They murdered him. Nothing was ever proven. The official ruling was accident. After that, most folks gave up the fight and sold out." "But not you," Faith said softly. Samuel met her gaze. "Not me." Faith reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm not selling either." His fingers tightened around hers. "Faith, I can't ask you to take that risk. You're not asking, I'm choosing." She held his gaze steadily. "This is my home now, Samuel. I won't be driven away by threats." Something shifted in Samuel's eyes, then respect, admiration, and something deeper that made Faith's heart beat faster. "Then we'll stand together," he said simply. The next day, they rode to meet with the other remaining small ranchers in the area, gathering at old Johnson's place. Besides Johnson, a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War, there were the Wilson brothers from the East Ridge and Maria Fuentes, a widow who ran a small horse breeding operation. Together, they devised a plan. Johnson and the Wilsons would ride to Cheyenne to speak directly with the territorial governor, bringing documentation of Blackstone's water diversion. Meanwhile, Samuel, Faith, and Maria would work to dismantle enough of the dam to restore some water flow to their properties, technically illegal but necessary for survival. The night before their planned action, Faith couldn't sleep, her mind racing with both fear and determination. Just after midnight, she heard a horse approaching. Grabbing her rifle, she moved to the window, relaxing only when she recognized Samuel's silhouette in the moonlight. She opened the door before he could knock. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, He seemed uncharacteristically uncertain. "I wanted to make sure you're still resolved about tomorrow. It's not too late to change your mind." Faith studied him in the silvery moonlight. "I'm not changing my mind, Samuel. It could be dangerous. Most worthwhile things are." She stepped back. "Come in. Since neither of us can sleep, we might as well have coffee." Inside, as Faith prepared coffee on the stove, Samuel paced her small cabin, clearly troubled. When she handed him a cup, their fingers brushed, and he seemed to come to a decision. "Faith, there's something I need to say before tomorrow." He set down the untouched coffee. "If anything happens to you because of this fight, Samuel, please let me finish." He took a deep breath. "When you first arrived, I helped you because it was the right thing to do. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. You became more than that." Faith's heart pounded as he stepped closer. "I love you, Faith Vance. I've loved you since I watched you face down Jenkins at the general store your first week here. I love your courage, your determination, your kindness." His voice grew softer. "And I need you to know that, whatever happens tomorrow." For a moment, Faith couldn't speak past the emotion tightening her throat. Then she closed the distance between them, placing her hands on his chest. "I love you too, Samuel Hayes. I think I have since you told me everyone but me on that first terrible day." His arms encircled her, drawing her close as his lips found hers in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened with months of unspoken longing. When they finally parted, breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "When this is over," he murmured, "I want to court you properly." Faith laughed softly. "I think we're beyond that point, don't you?" The next morning at dawn, they met Maria at the agreed location, a secluded spot near the dam. Working quickly and quietly, they began dismantling the structure enough to restore water flow without completely destroying it, a message rather than an act of war. They were nearly finished when the sound of approaching horses made them freeze. 5 Blackstone riders, including Marsh himself, appeared on the ridge above them. "Well, well," Marsh called, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "Caught you red-handed." Samuel stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Faith and Maria. "We're just restoring what was illegally taken, Marsh." Marsh dismounted, his men following suit. "This is Blackstone property. You're trespassing and destroying private property. That's worth jail time or worse." "The territorial governor might see things differently," Faith replied, refusing to be intimidated. "Especially when Johnson and the Wilsons show him evidence of your water theft." A flash of uncertainty crossed Marsh's face, quickly replaced by anger. "Those fools won't make it to Cheyenne. And you 3 won't be reporting anything to anyone." He drew his gun, pointing it at Samuel. "Hayes, you've been a thorn in my side for too long." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for Faith. Samuel tensed, preparing to draw his own weapon. Marsh's finger tightened on the trigger. Without thinking, Faith shoved Samuel aside just as the shot rang out. Searing pain exploded in her shoulder, spinning her around and dropping her to the ground. She heard Samuel shout her name, followed by more gunfire. Through a haze of pain, she saw Maria kneeling beside her, pressing a cloth to her wound. Samuel and the Blackstone men exchanged shots, but it was Maria who turned the tide, drawing a hidden derringer and hitting Marsh squarely in the chest. The remaining men, seeing their leader fall, quickly retreated. Samuel was at Faith's side in an instant, his face ashen with fear. "Faith, God, Faith, hold on." "I'm all right," she managed, though the pain was intense. "It's just my shoulder." "We need to get her to town," Maria said urgently. "To the doctor." Samuel gathered Faith carefully in his arms, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I can't lose you, not now." "You won't," Faith promised, clinging to consciousness. "Everyone left, but you stayed. Now I'm staying too." The next days passed in a blur of pain and recovery. The town doctor removed the bullet and declared Faith fortunate the wound was clean and had missed any vital areas. Samuel never left her side, sleeping in a chair beside her bed at the doctor's house. News arrived that Johnson and the Wilsons had indeed reached Cheyenne, and territorial marshals were investigating Blackstone's operations. Marsh had survived his wound, but was under arrest for attempted murder. More significantly, Everett Blackstone himself had arrived from Boston, apparently shocked by his foreman's methods and eager to make amends. A week after the shooting, Samuel carried Faith back to her homestead, where she was surprised to find several neighbors had repaired her chicken coop and tended her garden in her absence. "The town's talking about you," Samuel told her as he settled her comfortably on her porch. "The Boston lady who stood up to Blackstone and took a bullet for her cowboy," Faith smiled, reaching for his hand. "Is that what you are, my cowboy?" Samuel knelt beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "I want to be much more than that, Faith Vance. I want to be your husband if you'll have me." "I thought you'd never ask," Faith replied, tears of joy shimmering in her eyes. They were married that autumn, under the golden leaves of the cottonwood trees by Faith's Creek, which flowed freely once more. The small community gathered to celebrate Johnson, the Wilsons, Maria, even Jenkins from the general store, who presented them with a fine set of china as a wedding gift. To everyone's surprise, Everett Blackstone himself attended, offering a public apology and assurances that his company would now operate honorably. He had dismissed the remaining corrupt elements from his staff and proposed a fair water sharing agreement with all the neighboring ranches. As winter approached, Samuel moved his cattle to Faith's land, and together they expanded both properties into one thriving ranch. The Hayes Ranch became known for its hospitality, with Faith's garden producing the finest vegetables in the county and Samuel's careful breeding improving their small but growing herd. On their first anniversary, as they sat by the fire in what had once been Faith's lonely cabin, Samuel presented her with a gift, the deed to the adjacent property to the east, which they had been eyeing for expansion. "How did you manage this?" Faith asked, astonished. Samuel smiled, drawing her into his arms. "I've been saving for years, waiting for the right opportunity. And the right partner," Faith added, nestling against him. "That was the most important part," he agreed, kissing her tenderly. "When you said everyone had left." "You answered everyone but me," Faith completed softly. "And now neither of us will ever be alone again." Outside, snow began to fall on the Wyoming prairie, but inside the Hayes home, warmth and love abounded, a beacon of hope in the wild frontier they had both chosen to call home.